Welcome to ecotopiaU. I'm your host, Melissa McGinnis, and I'm joined by my co-host, Tom Wright. Today we're going to be discussing climate chaos. Hi, Tom. How are you today?
Good.
Good. Well, I'm really excited to discuss this. Not that it's an exciting thing, but it's kind of a different way of looking at what we've been hearing, which is global warming.
Yeah, I mean, we call things global warming, and in a way it's appropriate, but in a way it confuses because we're having this conversation just after a major snowstorm in the East Coast of the United States. And so it's hard for people to understand how could everything be warming, and yet we're having these severe winter events. In a way, it's a little bit commonsensical, actually, and that's why maybe the word chaos is more apropos to explain the phenomena. The overall trend of global warming is a matter of fact, or this is what the measurements are telling us. 2014 was the warmest year across the global land and ocean surfaces since records began being kept in 1880. The average annual temperature was about 1.24 Fahrenheit above the 20th century average. It easily broke the previous records, which were set in 2005 and 2010. 9 of the 10 warmest recorded temperatures, average temperatures across the globe, have been in the 21st century, and the 10th year was 1998. So within in the last 20 years have been the warmest 10 years of recorded. So it's not a matter of debate whether these temperatures have been recorded or not. They're just record keeping.
So in essence, global warming is a fact. The temperature of the Earth is warmer.
Yeah, the oceans and the atmosphere is, of course, what they're measuring, and that is true. Again, it's not particular rocket science because we're changing the makeup of the atmosphere and the oceans through the combustion and extraction processes of fossil resources. In particular, we're adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and we're adding carbon to the oceans, which acidifies the oceans. And again, the measurements, and science is not trying to trick people, the measurements bear this out. I mean, the carbon used to be below the ground 200 years ago. It wasn't being used. It wasn't being extracted. So that's where it was. It was in a very state, the fancy term is in low entropy, and it was just kind of sitting there, not disordered at all. And so the basic science I want to get across are the first and second law of thermodynamics, which the first law is about conservation of energy matter, and the second law is about the law of entropy, and which is a law that the universe tends towards disorder once the order's been disturbed. So another way to say it is nothing disappears and everything spreads. And so the carbon has to be going somewhere. It's not going under the rug. Just because we're using it up and we don't see it anymore, as you know, it goes from coal to fire energy plant, and it ends up being coal ash. Just because that occurred doesn't mean the carbon disappeared.
So maybe you could explain to us a little bit more about this carbon phenomenon. It was under the ground. This is what's causing global warming. This is what.
Well, it's the spreading of the carbon. I mean, something's changing, right? The biochemistry of the atmosphere is changing. The makeup of the atmosphere is not the same that it was 200 years ago. Same with the oceans. And again, just through measurement, we know this is true. So it's beyond conjecture. We're actually measuring the amount of CO2 in the middle and upper atmosphere. And we're noticing that there's a change of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide, which are the three most commonly discussed greenhouse gases. There'll be a graphic in this that we're going to fit in here to try to explain this better, a pre-industrial graphic of greenhouse gases and then an industrial graphic of greenhouse gases to show how the concentration is changing due to combustion, basically.
So that it's being released into the air, the air is actually changing.
Yeah, the makeup of the air, the chemistry of the air is changing. Yes.
And then that causes the temperatures on the Earth to be warmer.
You have okay. So to kind of verbally talk about the graphic, what you have is you have sunlight coming in through the atmosphere. The reason we have life on the planet is because we have atmosphere.
Okay.
Without atmosphere, there's no life. So it's so there always was some greenhouse gases because that's what created the warming, the blanketing. So you have sunlight coming in, and then some of it bounces back into outer space. If you change the concentration of these greenhouse gases, what's happening is they're keeping some more of that warming sun rays that don't bounce out as much anymore. They keep more of it. There's more of a blanketing effect. So that's why it's somewhat predictable. If you put more blankets on, you're going to be warmer. It's because we're changing the concentration of these greenhouse gases. And they're called that, I guess, because they do have the ability to capture heat. That's why they got named that.
Okay.
Okay.
So on record, you said 1880. We've been keeping records, temperature records since 1880.
Yeah.
Just in the last 20 years, they've shot through the roof. And just last year, 2014, was the warmest record since we've been recording.
It was the highest anomaly given the track record of the 135 years. It was the highest anomaly from the average too.
So it's a factual statement to say that our temperatures here on Earth have been gradually rising, more so after the Industrial Revolution and more so in the last 20 years.
Right. Although again, not to get into more complexity here, this is possible that the world had other times where we had these temperature ranges, but this was pre-human. It wasn't when we existed.
Right.
It's possible that the Earth had these kind of temperature ranges before, but that isn't what we're trying to discuss. We're trying to discuss, I think, why the metaphor climate chaos may make more sense to most people if they think it through than climate change even, and global warming may create a lot of office cooler arguments because you're experiencing cold.
Well,
winter.
that's the point I want to get to. So first, I wanted to really just point out that there is an official database and record keeping of temperatures on the planet, and yes, last year was the warmest that since we've been keeping records. You just brought up that we have experiencing a snowstorm on the East Coast. How do you talk about, or how could you frame or argue, if you will, global warming with severe snowstorms we've been seeing in the last couple of years?
Yeah, it would be debatable if we have snowstorms in June, but having snowstorms in January is part of why it's happening. It's January, okay? The Earth's tilted. It's obviously colder to begin with in January in the northern hemisphere. The other main issue to understand how the warming affects the intensity of the snowstorm is that you have the Arctic, which is melting more each summer and solidifying less each winter. In other words, the actual size of the northern ice cap is less. Okay, so again, don't say that it disappeared. Nothing disappears. It's like, where did that water vapor go? Where did the temperature go too? So you basically have, and people have heard this. People have heard about the polar vortex, and so this happens. This is an undulating fact between winter and summer, that you have the coldness moving up during the summer because it's melting. Okay, but what's happening now, instead of the vortex staying right above the pole, it's moving because there's this chaotic phenomena going on. That's the easiest way to explain it. It makes it more difficult, I guess, to understand because everybody wants some sort of linear explanation, cause and effect explanation. That's not fair either to say it's perfect cause and effect. What is explainable is that there's colder air up, and there's more moisture because the temperature of the surface water is warmer, so the evaporation's greater. So you have cold air meets water vapor, voila, you have snow. Okay, and it's January. So the idea that global warming contradicts a cold winter storm is not true. If anything, it actually suggests that you're going to have more severe storms, more severe undulations. The hurricanes, just the opposite. The warm waters themselves will create, in the tropic zones where there's hurricanes, more severe hurricanes and typhoons.
Which we've seen.
Yeah, just ask somebody from the Philippines.
And also, would that explain some of the tornadoes that we've seen through the summer in the Midwest?
Explain.
In terms of velocity and frequency.
All we can say is that it's more likely to happen because this phenomena is creating, in essence, this undulation, this chaotic pattern. So what we considered norms, over the last 10,000 years, the norms are changing. Mm-hmm. It's probably easier to say it that way, so that the extreme, what we're calling extreme weather events, both cold and warm, both velocity of hurricanes and frequency of tornadoes, etc. Yes, but that's just because we're in essence, the set of expectations is changing to these extremes. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I want to make sure this is understood.
Well, I think what you're saying is that these are normal we're supposed to have snow in February, and we've always had hurricanes and tornadoes. But you're saying in terms of the volume
because of the change between the warm and cold, which is what creates a tornado. Mm-hmm. Okay, they're more likely to happen because of these events. Okay, and the extremity of it's more likely to be extreme because there's warmer and colder temperatures both, and so you're going to have more change than less change. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm saying climate chaos.
Which brings us back to why this topic is called climate chaos, because the global warming is causing chaotic patterns, whether it's cold, hot, snow.
Well, the likelihood of an extreme event occurs more because there's more extreme cold and hot. Mm-hmm. And if there's more moisture in the air when a cold event occurs, and that's more snow.
Mm-hmm. I think it's much better to call what's happening climate chaos versus global warming. I think that's a little bit misleading. To your point, how could somebody say that on the East Coast when they're sitting, in feet of snow?
Yeah, not that, but even the name of the organization that I was quoting earlier, I want to make sure I get the organization right. Even they, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, even they are saying that precipitation measured on land-based stations around the globe was near average on a balance. So even though you have these events, the extremities is what the set is, the math term. The set is changing. In other words, on the left and the right side of your graph is changing, but the average precipitation is the same. Interestingly enough, so it's the fact that we're having more. Your bell curve is getting broader, mm-hmm. Or if you want to put it that way, probably not the right way to put it in terms of the actual curve, how it looks, but that maybe the listener can hear it that way. The other thing to remind is that because you're changing biochemistry of atmosphere, the oceans draw down from the atmosphere some of that carbon, which changes the acidic, it lowers the pH of the oceans, which means that creatures that rely on building carbon shells or coral, for instance, they're less likely to survive because the pH is lowering. So the reason chaos is, again, a better metaphor is because if those creatures die off, that's a change, mm-hmm. and so there'll be a substitute phenomena, right? Again, everything spreads and nothing disappears. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have something substitute for it, but that's less predictable than we've been used to for the last 10,000 years. That's why I'm saying chaos is a better metaphor. Mm-hmm. So if we lose all our coral reefs, we're not going to die. The pleasure of those living things is going to die.
But don't we get a lot of oxygen from our oceans? So what if you're talking about ocean acidification? Wouldn't that directly involve our survival?
Well, that's a complex question. It's a great question. Actually, when you have more CO2 in the air, it's going to change things. What survives, again, the better way to say it is what survives is going to be different than what was living 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you have more CO2 in the air, you can actually grow more things because more plant life can draw it down. That would be true for algae, okay, as much as for palm trees. But the truth of the matter is we're deforesting faster than we're building forests. So the denier wants to say, well, more CO2 in the air is better for plants. Well, if you were worried about growing plants, if you're worried about sequestering carbon in soil, I'd have to agree to a certain extent. But I don't see all those ducks being lined up in a row. I don't see people. I don't see big universities that are trying to get more organic farmers in line to sequester carbon, more organic range farmers get in line to have animals poop on a larger array of fields so that we sequester more carbon. I don't see that same phenomena, nor do I see reforestation at any sort of rate that's equal to deforestation. So we're claiming at the same rate either. I mean, again, we could study this individually. Just the reforestation rate of the planet is we're losing more forest than we're gaining forest.
That would be the most depressing show if we were to just focus on that.
There's aerial maps of Brazil that are very stunning about
it's that. That's heartbreaking, and I think we should discuss that at some point. But so when we first started hearing about global warming, that was about 20 years ago?
Well, okay, so now you're opening up. I'm an old guy routine here. So the first time I heard it was I went to University of California at San Diego, Revelle College, which is named after a gentleman named Roger Revelle, who is considered like the father of the greenhouse gas metaphor. And so I heard one of his graduate students lecture about his thesis in 1972. At the same time, it's the first time I saw what are called the Keeling effects, or the Keeling graphs, which are the temperature change cycle at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And again, he's a UC San Diego professor at Scripps. And so UC San Diego just happens to be the center of some of the best early thinking about this. And so it's the late 50s that the first thesis started to come forward. And I think the first significant book is about 1988. Bill McKibben wrote a significant book called The End of Nature. And so I think since 1988, we've had a really good grasp of the issue. So. And
then what was that president that took it on as his platform? Vice President.
Oh,
Al Gore. Al Gore.
Al Gore, who was a graduate student at Harvard when Roger Revelle was there as a guest professor. Yeah. So.
And what's happened since we've decided to discuss this, or Al Gore's kind of opened it up for us here in Los Angeles. We're discussing it. What's happened since? We know that this is happening. Is it reversible? Are we doing something about it? Is it going to get worse? Like, where are we headed?
It's interesting that I know that there's a segment of the wake up community that's referring to solutions to reverse climate change. I'm uncomfortable with that metaphor, calling reverse. I mean, it would be akin to, you've seen those James Bond races up and down hills with the small sports cars, and somehow they always cling to the side of the hill and stuff. It'd be like if you'd run those races in reverse, that would be how complex reversing this whole system would be. So I just don't think that's the appropriate. I mean, imagine trying to run those races in reverse. It's just not putting a camera in reverse is not what I'm suggesting, by the way, either. I'm saying, so the complexity of reversing it, I think, is a little stretch. But can we adapt? Can we mitigate? Yes. Do we need to sort of agree on a parts per million that's a survivable parts per million? That would be probably smart. Bill McKibben says 350 parts per million. Okay, we're closing in on 400 parts per million.
Explain to our viewers parts per million.
That's the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere.
So there's a livable place, but once we exceed that, humans are going to die?
Well, the average temperature is going to change, and again, the Earth is going to survive. So it always will. Yeah. It always will, and there's certain animals like cockroaches or whatever that seem to always survive, but it's going to be adaptive. I do think that some of the solutions for food are more farmers that know how to farm organically, build organic material in the soil, because more organic material helps both the retention and the sequestering of carbon, which also helps retain water, moisture in the soil. So again, the undulation of the events is less likely to harm us if we're smart about carbon sequestration and we're smart about water retention. Water and carbon cycles work together. Without a water cycle, the carbon cycle, the uptake, in other words, the photosynthesis that back to the plant liking the CO2, the plant can like the CO2 as long as there's fresh water around, and on land, so.
So one of the ways that we have to accept that this is happening, and it seems like it's getting worse. We're headed towards something even worse. But if we want to day to day feel like we're contributing to the opposite, you're suggesting buying and supporting organic farmers is a big help.
Well, it's a big help. I do, and we need the sons and daughters out there listening, youngins listening, to think about it as a gig, even if they don't think about it as a full-time gig, a part-time gig would be really nice. I also think, try to do as much you can to build renewable energy systems in your life. Certainly photovoltaics or wind energy systems in your life. There's plenty of energy in the world. It isn't a lack of energy. It's a matter of...
We're just using the dirty sources.
Yeah, it seems like it. Not that, but we're combusting the carbon, therefore you can't use it again, in a sense. It's kind of bizarre because carbon is very pertinent to building materials, and so.
And also, I would suggest you mentioned the deforestation. That's probably a huge impact because that helps sequester.
Correct.
The carbon. So support non-virgin trees for paper towels. If you're going to use paper towels, things like that. We don't want to cut any more forests. We don't want to have any more deforestation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I happen to know a little bit of trivia about that. It's one of those things that the recycled content paper costs more to make than virgin paper.
Oh, so then we're burning energy somewhere else, making. So
no, it's just that it's. No, you're smart about saying that. I'm not trying to contradict you. Actually, I'm just trying to say it's there's an irony out there that some of the better things to do are going to cost us more. So that's just it. If it costs, I've always said this: if you had to pay $10 a gallon for gasoline, would you actually die?
No, I just wouldn't drive.
You wouldn't drive, right? So you're not going to die. So
yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't die, but I wouldn't be driving at $10 a gallon, and I don't think anybody else would.
You wouldn't drive as much,
right?
Or you adapt, or you'd learn to drive with people more often, or you'd promote
public transportation. Nothing's wrong with that.
Yeah. You just promote systems that didn't use as much energy per unit of transference. Transportation needs to be looked at. Farming needs to be looked at. Price of fossil fuel needs to be looked at because the cheaper fossil fuel is, for instance, we tend towards more of a meat diet. That the confined animal feeding operations create a lot of methane. Okay, so there is an argument that going vegan would help this. At the same time, the animal feces, if done correctly, if not concentrated, if the animals were spread out and actually were grass-fed, range-fed, that's a different paradigm than a CAFOS paradigm, which is a combined animal feeding operation paradigm. It would be better for us and the animals, and the diet, that's a question. I think people have to realize that as a species, I think it'd be hard to argue that we evolved as a vegan species. We didn't. We evolved as omnivores. And so to a certain extent, there's just our genetics is built on being an omnivore. Now, do we have to eat as much meat as we are eating in America?
And the factory farming, can we have responsible farming? Why can't we have the way nature intended? The animals eat the grass, we get the omegas from that. We don't to raise corn and soy in the GMO methods that we discussed on our last show.
The whole idea of monoculture, yeah.
To feed the cattle, which just creates more methane because they can't really process it. It's a disaster. What I think is interesting about climate chaos, and I'm so glad we're discussing this today, is that it's unavoidable for anyone. You can't go anywhere in the world and hide from it because it's a global issue.
Yeah, and it's very interesting how it shows up too, because in California, and I live in Northern California, we've had a drought. We're going on the third year of a drought cycle, and California's had droughts before the industrial age, California had droughts, and so it's kind of interesting how the chaos shows up. In December, up in Oakland, we had 7 inches of rain, which is a lot of rain for a month in California. I know people back on the East Coast or up of the Pacific Northwest snicker at 7 inches being a lot of rain, but it's a lot of rain for Northern California. So fortunately, Northern California has reservoirs, a lot of reservoirs, so a lot of that water wasn't lost, it was stored. And we're very fortunate. At the same time, when meteorologists were asked, was the drought over because we had 7 inches of rain, to a T, they all said, no, we don't know that for a fact. We don't know that. And here we are at the end of January, and it hasn't rained since.
And cities that don't have reservoirs, a lot of that rain is lost because it's not penetrable.
Yeah. And then that we're taking away the soil's ability to absorb water because we're building buildings, building human artifact with freeways and cement and asphalt everywhere, which of course doesn't absorb water.
Right.
And just heads out to the ocean real quick.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this is, and I don't want it to be a discouraging topic. Obviously, it's real, and we have to face it and discuss it. But I'd like to kind of leave this segment on, a little bit more activation. So it's really happening. You can't avoid it anywhere in the world. What can you do to feel good about yourself daily that you're not continuing to contribute to global warming? I think we kind of hit on a couple of things a little bit earlier about public transportation.
And I think we do have to develop more bike-friendly communities. Obviously, in more urban areas, it'd be better if we bicycled than most other transportation. It'd be easier, better for you health-wise. I think that we can also just agree that if we, I do believe we need to be active about the price of carbon. Whether you call it a carbon tax. Roger Revelle said we should add $1 a gallon. Okay, now Roger Revelle died in 1991. Okay, so you can imagine back then it was about $1 a gallon for gas. So he's basically saying double the price of gasoline. And he wasn't saying this as a matter of a threat or anything. He was just saying to get it to a true price. So I do think as an activist, be hip to that, because if gas does get to $10 a gallon because we're proactive this way, what does your lifestyle look like? And the more you're used to that lifestyle, I think the easier this phenomenon will occur for you.
We need a paradigm shift in the way we think about just our day-to-day. If it does get to that, are you prepared? Have you figured out your public transportation? Are you bringing reusable bags to the grocery store or any errand? Actually, I have one in my bag all the time if I'm just going to even buy a dress somewhere or something. I think that's important. And again, supporting organic farmers for several reasons. One, to help mitigate climate chaos. It's the number one thing to do is really support organic farmers. But for so many other reasons as well, which we'll get into with the library of our podcast. We kind of discussed this over and over again, why it's so important to support your organic farmers. But definitely in case of climate chaos, that's one thing that you can do and feel good about.
Yes, and so, like I said to the young people out there, think about this as an occupation. We need more people involved with farming and gardening to farm and to sequester carbon.
To sequester the carbon. Well, I just want to thank you again, Tom, for being here today. This was a really valuable topic. I hope that our viewers learned some things and as well feel activated to go out and change their behavior daily. And stay tuned next time for another episode of ecotopiaU.